Session 10, Beyond Metrics, Evaluability Tools for Climate Project Success. I know that this is the last session of the day, so you must be really tired. Please feel free to stretch out your legs and arms, and just to encourage you also that we have this table that has the GCF IEU publications, evaluation briefs, some approach briefs as well, and you're welcome to take a look at them and take some when you go. So I want to make sure you are not too tired and you're thrilled about this session. We will make sure this will be fun, informative, and with key takeaways, important key takeaways. Okay, so I think we can get started. This is a session that's organized by the Green Climate Fund Independent Evaluation Unit, GCF IEU, and we are privileged to have a panelist from ADB as well, ADB Independent Evaluation Office. So this is going to be really informative session. It's about going beyond just evaluations, project evaluations, and we want to bring to you some evaluability tools that can ensure learning and that could help strengthen our own learning, improve the quality of evaluations, and also that could support the capacity building work that we should do. All right, so make sure to also fill out the survey at the end of the session. The Asian Evaluation Week Secretariat colleagues would love to hear from you on what has been really good and what are the areas that they could improve also. Okay, Pia, if you could turn to the takeaway slide. Yes, so just as a simple introduction of the session, this session will showcase how global evidence reviews, evaluability studies, and evaluation quality assessments can strengthen learning in our climate evaluations. And presenters from the GCF IEU will highlight what we know from the evidence reviews we've conducted and how evaluability studies, including work on theories of change and alignment with the results management framework of the fund, can build readiness for impact evaluations and lessons from quality assessments of project evaluations. So together with our fellow panelists from ADB, Garrett Kilroy, a discussion will explore how these approaches can inform project design, improve accountability, but also quality and learning, and contribute to building a stronger climate evaluation culture. My name is Yeonji Kim, and I am Evaluation Update Specialist from the Green Climate Fund Independent Evaluation Unit. I'm very happy that you've joined us. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the first speaker, Mr. Andreas Reumann, the head of the GCF Independent Evaluation Unit. And please note that this session includes many rapid-fire presentations, and then we are going to turn to a panel discussion, and I want to make sure we give enough time for a very interactive Q&A towards the end. So, Andreas, with that, over to you.
Thank you, Yeonji. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us for such a late session. I know it's difficult. So I've been told a couple of things by my team. I love to talk, so I should not talk as much. I should find a concise way of messaging what this is all about. And now a little bit to the title. We said beyond metrics, evaluation and evidence. We recognize at the fund that evaluations are really important and are a key feature in the project cycle work, but also in just looking at the overall institution and what we could be doing better to be faster, better and smarter in the future. However, with this undertaking, we found a couple of challenges along the way. And that's what I want to introduce today, the challenges. As evaluators, you might know, fellow evaluators, it's always quite an interesting work as an evaluator, and challenges are the best friends of an evaluator. Yeah, thanks. So the first challenge is this, climate urgency. So we recognize as a fund we have a lot of trade-offs to reckon with. One of the trade-offs is, okay, we want impact, and the highest possible impact is something that needs to be planned and needs to be executed in the right manner, in the right context, with, at best, a lot of stakeholder consultations. At the same time, you're facing climate urgency. So at the fund, we found this to be quite challenging, of making a good value proposition for the evaluative work of the independent evaluation unit. So that's the first challenge that I want to share with you today. The second challenge is complexity. So we found, and you've heard me perhaps speak in other sessions already about this, so I'll just do it quickly. We recognize that climate action is not a question for few, it's a question for all of us. And we recognize that this means that the climate interactions are also multifaceted. Projects look at various sectors, various set of actors in various and multiple countries. So it's always a conversation that's quite difficult, because you're trying to go for a project that from the outside might look as a simple development project, but then there's a lot of add-ons, a lot of other things that need to be tackled. So we recognize that that has been difficult for the project teams as well as for the evaluators. So we ask ourselves the question, okay, what does that mean in terms of complexity of a project and the project development to the evaluator? And it's also creating complexities in terms of how we would conduct evaluations. Another problem that just aligns with this quite well is this problem of the climate and climate change evaluations being very new. We recognize we need a lot of we need to look at a lot of different methodological options to really bring about the impact stories that both the fund but also the donors are waiting for. So this is the second challenge that I want to share with you today. And then coming to the third one, it is this entire mess that we have, and you know, imagine an ant's nest. You have a lot of things that are moving parts and moving bits. So how do you put this together to really make sense of what you're seeing in front of you and how impacts are coming about? And this is basically this picture that I looked for quite some time. I think it took me, AI didn't understand what I wanted, but it took me a good hour to come back to something that we've done previously. We've done a learning paper on complexity in climate, and that was the picture from there. So I photoshopped it into this slide. So here, what I mean by this is, we've already spoke about it. We need to think about something quickly. We are facing complexity, and we're needing to bring this all together to make sense of this. And in this quest, we realized quite quickly, and the GCF was established it's only been 10 years, so it's been roughly established in 2015 with its first projects coming into place and coming to life. And the independent evaluation unit was only founded in 2017. So what we realized quite quickly is that those that we report to, the board of directors, the board of the GCF, were asking us for stories, for impact stories, because they were used to this. They were used to this from the ADB, they were used to this from the EBRD and from all sorts of tracks of work that they had done previously. So they very quickly said, okay, what's the impact? Tell us stories, tell us where are the solutions here. So this is the intent for this session today. We want to go beyond evaluations because we recognize at that very point in 2018, we're not able to answer these questions because projects were just about to start. And we said, okay, what do we have in our repertoire as evaluators, as a young evaluation unit, to think about impact in a different way? And these are the presentations that you will see today of what we've tried to do in order to provide meaningful evidence to the board, as well as to the Secretariat, in order to show the value add of having an independent evaluation unit. Okay, so this was my last. This was basically the introduction to this. Not that long, I think. Okay, I was told to also do the introductions to the panel. I'm not quite sure where the slide would be. Let me just go back real quick. Here we go, we're losing time again. Yeah, I think it's just before that one. Yes, it is. Thank you. So we've got an array of different people from different tracks. Most importantly, we've got Garrett Kilroy, a principal evaluation specialist from the Asian Development Bank, from the independent evaluation department there. So we're really glad to have you here today. He's also going to speak about this from the perspective of the ADB. We've got Buyong Yang, a researcher at the Independent Evaluation Unit, who's going to speak to you about some interesting work that we've done with quality assurance around project evaluations. We have also got an impact evaluation specialist, Michelle Dong, who is joining here today. And then we have got, of course, you've heard of already from her, Yeonji Kim, who is our uptake specialist. So all about how can we actually, how do we bring the dissemination of evaluations into place. Okay, so now fast forward. I think I'm the kicker here for the first presentation, if I'm not mistaken. Is there a chance to help me with this? Okay, sorry. Holy moly, okay. Evidence review, that's it. Okay, colleagues, so as I said to you, we were finding ourselves with all these problems. So what we've done is we started saying, okay, what do we know globally? We're a young fund. We want to learn from others. How do we do this best? So the IEU conducted a couple of global evidence reviews where we just collated together with 3IE and others, collated the knowledge that we have globally about impact evaluations and systematic reviews for certain topics. So we really were there on the quest to ask this question, okay, what do we know in specific areas, what works, what doesn't, and for whom? And we did this just to really better understand of what projects would have to look like at the GCF in order to yield impact. And we've done one for climate change adaptation. So we're very quickly questioned ourselves, okay, what's out there in the global evidence space? So we looked at the Web of Science, other you know, those research engines where you've got all the published peer-reviewed papers. We very quickly realized that we're falling into a trap of bias. So, you know, as we know, these are very well-researched papers, but there's a lot else out there that's coming predominantly also from the developing world that would help us to understand what works, what doesn't, and for whom. So very quickly, we needed to look at the different biases that we see when we look at the collection of evidence that's out there. And that's what we try to do with our evidence reviews ever since, to not only stay in this field of peer-reviewed articles, but also take and acknowledge other works that have been done in the past. So here there's a couple of traditional reviews really have a lot of biases. So the selection bias is the one that I just mentioned, but there's obviously other biases that you would have to control for in your work. Now, in the outset of climate change, of the evidence review on climate change adaptation, we realized very quickly that there's a huge evidence gap. And that's also an evidence gap in terms of time. So we looked at the global Web of Science for results on climate change adaptation and looked at the records that were there per year. What we really quickly found out is that before 2010, there was barely nothing mentioned about climate change adaptation in the global literature. And again, talking about impact evaluations and systematic reviews, that was what we were interested in. We really wanted to know, do we know anything about impact? We also found that the evidence that is there is often very scattered. So it's in only a particular areas, not everywhere where we would want to look into in terms of sectors, but also in terms of outcomes. We very quickly saw that they're looking at adoption studies. They're not so much looking into what impacts are we after that are for sustainability in the long term. So how are we changing policy systems? How are we creating an enabling environment and policy? And that was at the time what the GCF was looking at, complex projects that not only look at, and I'll give you an example, in agriculture to provide a new variety of seeds, we were actually going further to say, okay, when we have done this, what else do we need to do in order to make this sustainable for the long run? So these were some of the findings the first findings that struck us. So we were really realizing we were in a very young field. We then said, okay, what is the theory of change of climate resilience? We were startled by the fact that the UNFCCC had no common a framework to say what is climate change adaptation, what is resilience. So we used, with the help of two IPCC reports, 2007 and 2014, the understanding that was put there on how to look at climate change adaptation. On the one hand, you see the sensitivity and the exposure risks and the vulnerabilities with communities. That was the big discussion there. And on the other hand, you see the question about hazard and the risk. So a little bit more of a loss and damage question, if you like, from the perspective of climate change adaptation, or what climate change adaptation could be. This was really important to us because when we started with our PICOs, when we started with our inclusion and exclusion criteria for studies that would have information that help us to understand impacts in the climate space, would really help us to see what could be included, what would have to be excluded. And here you see a database that we ran back then manually. There was no AI in 2018, so we did this all manually. We reviewed about 9,956 studies to see, and from the abstracts, to see if they were relevant or not, and then had certain decision trees that brought us down to 464 studies that we felt were really talking about impacts in the climate adaptation space. Colleagues, sorry that I'm going through so fast, but I think the story is far more interesting than the actual numbers, but happy to discuss this further if needed. So, as a result, okay, that's clear. As a result, we put together what we call an evidence gap map. And I know some of you may have seen this before, especially those guys from FreeIE, but we really looked at, okay, what are the sectors that we usually would interact in terms of climate change adaptation? And what is this? And this is the top line there from left to right. What are the outcomes that we would like to see in a theory of change for resilience? So we coined this as uptake, adoption, shocks and stressors, so addressing shocks and stressors, decrease exposure, decrease impact risk. And then the adaptive capacity and the enabling environment. That for us was what we felt was the most logical way to go about climate adaptation projects. And in conclusion, you see, of course, the collection of all the different studies that we felt from the 464 studies that we used were giving us interesting insights into what works and what doesn't in terms of impacts. We also organized them into the different, was it an experimental study, quasi-experimental study, or a systematic review? You see that up the top there in the different colors to also color code a little bit of what sort of studies are we looking at. What we see, and just to perhaps give that here, we see a lot in forestry, fishery, and agriculture. So a lot of evidence was out there already that showed us what works and what doesn't in this context. We were surprised, there was the least informed area was water. And water, we really looked at all sorts of water projects that you can imagine, from wash to water infrastructure to irrigation systems and so on and so forth. We felt that it was globally not enough that were showing us not only development impacts, but also impacts that really identified climate change adaptation as such in this. This was, and just to give you a little bit of a conclusion, hopefully it's coming, this was for us quite important. It's going, I think here we go. This was for us quite important because it gave us a couple of learnings about the area that the GCF was going to venture into. We realized there were a couple of gaps in water and built environments. There were gaps when it comes to interventions. It really depended on the sector of what interventions were really relatively unknown. We looked at absolute gaps. So when you look at the area here at the end, you had very little information across. So the institutional systems were relatively untouched. Sorry, I'll repeat this. So the very end, the institutional systems were there was very little information out there for this. And we also saw concentration. So there was a lot in agriculture, there was a lot in conservation efforts in agriculture, irrigation, extension services related to agriculture. And there were lots in the early outcomes when you look at the outcomes pairs on adoption and economic benefits. So this helped us to shape the story and the conversation in the fund about what climate projects do we want. And in subsequent discussions, we said to the management in the fund as well as to the board, look, there's a lot of evidence. Some areas, geographic areas, are really not researched enough. They're underserved. we also found that there were great opportunities to provide more story, more evidence that would be needed globally. And we also gave some policy advice to say, okay, we could overlay this with the funding that's currently out there in the MDBs to see where the areas that are untouched, are there opportunities for the GCF to venture into. So we really started from this point to say we have very little that we know about our current projects, but let's open this and let's think about what else could we be bringing as evaluators that help us to understand how projects could have the highest possible impact at an institutional level. This is my first presentation. I hope you find it insightful. I'll hand it over to the next colleague that's coming up here, which is Michelle Dong, our impact evaluation specialist. Over.
As Andreas introduced, my name is Michelle Dong, and I'm an impact evaluation specialist with the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. And today I'll be introducing an evaluability study that our unit is working on. So this evaluability study, the motivation behind stems back to the first performance review conducted by IEU, the forward-looking performance review of the Green Climate Fund. And as you can see in this quote, there were 3 gaps that were identified to credibly report the impact and effectiveness of GCF projects. That GCF, first in terms of the funding proposals, there is a gap. Second, in terms of monitoring and evaluation framework, the review identified some weaknesses. And lastly, in terms of lack of coherence in the log frame. So that's how the IU team started this evaluability study in 2019. And at its core, it tries to answer this question: to what extent can the projects and programs supported by the GCF credibly report their own impacts and effectiveness in an evidence-based and robust manner? And there are 2 objectives for conducting this study. First, to assess the quality at entry of the GCF funding proposals. And second, it's more of a learning opportunity to provide evidence-based learning opportunities for the GCF, which I'll elaborate later. And up to now, 3 evaluability studies have been published. The first one in 2019, second one in 2022, and today I'll be presenting the results from the 2024 evaluability study. Now, the method we used to conduct this evaluability study, first we conducted a desk review of 214 projects, funding proposals that were approved up to 2023. And we try to assess them in 4 main areas, and each area contains 5 criteria. So these areas include theory of change, potential for measurement of causal change and evaluability, implementation fidelity and performance against investment criteria, and lastly, the data collection and reporting system. And a stoplight assessment is used to analyze funding proposal against these 4 areas. And the reason why we're using the stoplight system is because for the funding proposal, we cannot, with absolute certainty, say that it is evaluable or not, because it's prior to the implementation. So what we can say is the likelihood of this funding proposal having a certain degree of risk. So each criteria is categorized into low risk, medium risk, and high risk. So starting with the theory of change. For the first area, we try to measure the strength of the theory of change, including the quality of the theory of change itself, the causal pathways identified, the quality of evidence that are used for the theory of change, to discuss the causal linkages, and lastly, if the theory of change anticipated any unintended consequences. Now, based on the results from the 2024 evaluability study, the results are pretty mixed. So in terms of good quality of evidence, we find that 51% of the funding proposal discuss good quality of evidence when they discuss causal linkages. However, the challenges in terms of reporting unintended consequences is pretty high. Almost 30% of the funding proposals face challenge in reporting unintended consequences. Now, in terms of the second area, in the potential measurement of causal change. So we try to go beyond just tracking the progress, outputs, and outcomes, and we try to understand the causal change. The possibility of the funding proposal to report the causal change. Now, in terms of this area, there is high level of risk across most criteria. As you can see, there is a red light for both the methods for measuring causal change. 50% of the funding proposals are at high risk, and 54% of the funding proposals have potential biases when they report the impact that they plan to report in their funding proposal. Now, on the next area, it's the implementation, fidelity, and performance against investment criteria. So we really look into the eligibility and targeting criteria, how well articulated it is within the funding proposal, as well as measuring the impact potential, paradigm potential, and other GCF investment criteria. And as you can see in this figure, in terms of implementation fidelity, the funding proposals are generally well addressed. So they have a strong implementation plan. Their measure for measuring impact potential and paradigm shift is also mostly at low risk. Lastly, we look into the system, data collection and reporting system. And in terms of this area, the finding is also mixed. So almost 50% of the funding proposals, they have available the baseline data at low risk, whereas the potential quality of data is at high risk. So it shows that overall they have a plan to collect their data, but the quality of data could also pose a challenge. So to conclude this presentation, the most improved area since the 2019, the first evaluability study, is that we have stronger theory of change, a baseline data collection measure, and implementation fidelity. At the same time, still some gaps remain, including the potential unintended consequences being articulated and the credible reporting of causal change. So how did the quality of this funding proposal improve over time? We think there were mainly three drivers. First, based on this evaluability study, there was clear guidance and templates provided by the GCF Secretariat that helped to clarify GCF requirements, including the theory of change being included, the baseline indicators being included within the funding proposal. Also, the evaluation policy, which is also introduced by our team, the Independent Evaluation Unit, not only stresses the importance of evaluation, but also provide more practical measures. For example, a ballpark measure on how much out of the total project budget should be allocated for monitoring and evaluation. Lastly, within the IU, we have the LORTA program, Learning-Oriented Real-Time Assessment Program, where we support accredited entities, our partners, to understand the causal impact of their GCF-funded projects, and also highlight those impact stories on the ground to the fund so that there is a learning loop. So this is the end of my presentation, and I hope to discuss this further during the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I'm also looking at you. I think you are still with us, so thank you. Andreas, you wanted to say something before Garrett's intervention? Yeah.
Colleagues, Colleagues, it's always hard to talk about risks. I want to share this with you because we really thought about this long and hard. For us, what we realized, it's very hard in the beginning. It was very hard for us as a unit to have a good conversation about results management. Because we recognized that results management was something that was completely underfunded and not recognized by management as much as it should have been, especially in the beginning in the outset of the fund really kicking in with multiple projects. So what we decided is, let's have a look at what could we foresee as a potential gap in the preparation of projects. So we said, okay, we're going to bring out this report, evaluability study, that only at portfolio level, never at project by project level, but at portfolio level gives the board a glimpse of the storyline that's not in the funding proposal. And that is to clearly outline what is going to happen with evaluations. What are we going to find? And these four components that Michelle here shared were basically the first ones that we could think of that are absolutely crucial for evaluations later on. So we said, what can we do? And I think Michelle did a very great job to explain those, but also to highlight what we've done then to the board. We said to the board, you got to do something. You got to think about the conversation with the results team needs to start at the beginning of the project, or even before that during the development stages. And that is exactly what happened. These templates were basically the result of that conversation, that we brought out this report that was, of course, a little bit, how should I put it, a little bit forceful given to the board in the sense to say, look, here there are risks. But it was a great conversation starter to really think about results management. So just to bring that into context, hopefully you have questions on this as well, but just to share that over from my end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So Garrett, we are ready for you. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Yunji and Andreas and GCF colleagues. My name is Garrett Kilroy. I'm with the evaluation department of ADB, and I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors for this paper. Shamaka was my co-team leader, and actually Nelson is in the room, and Beth is in the other room. She chose the other session. I always really like interacting with GCF. They're a younger evaluation unit, but they're very dynamic. They're thinking a lot about evaluation issues and evaluability. We're a more mature evaluation unit. So the positives are we have a mature portfolio. We have a lot of validations, but our guidelines are 10 years old. We're a little bit staid. The inertia is sometimes there. So I think it's good for us to interact more. And we're starting to see GCF co-finance projects come to completion, so we should encourage more of this interaction. I'll ask Pia to, I'm the one who's meant to press the, right. Okay. So I really enjoyed Michelle's presentation, and I would really like to unpack those charts to see where ADB's projects lie. Maybe not in public, but just it would also be useful to see how they align with some of the evaluability findings in this evaluation. This was a topical paper that we did and finished last year. We took off from our last sort of major climate evaluation, which finished in 2020. Our board was really keen that we check in and look at progress since that last evaluation. It's a topical paper, so there were no recommendations. There was no board discussion at the board, but that was a positive. It meant that operations staff were a bit more open, a bit more willing to discuss, and we did actually have an informal board seminar then with operations and with the board to discuss this paper. So it's a useful tool, I think, sometimes to discuss these some of these contentious issues. So we focused here on the strategic and institutional shifts, ADB's portfolio, and progress towards the climate outcomes from a design perspective. So the 3 years were quite consequential for ADB. In the run-up to the Glasgow COP, ADB was promoting itself as the climate bank for Asia and the Pacific. You don't hear that so often anymore, but we're evaluators. We don't evaluate rhetoric. We evaluate the objectives, and the objectives are still there. I'll just highlight two that the red boxes show. The Climate Action Coordination Committee was set up in 2022, and then the Climate Action Plan in 2023. They were two recommendations in our last evaluation. So how is ADB doing over the last few years? Well, we're on track for our climate finance targets. And indeed, it's getting to the point where we're starting to meet some of those targets. There was a target that 75% of our operations would be tagged climate finance by 2030. We've already met that. We have a new target that 50% of our commitments are climate finance, and we're getting close to that target as well. But of course, once you start to get close to your volumetric targets, the questions are, well, what are you actually achieving? What climate outcomes are you actually achieving for the developing member countries? So that's where we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into ADB's portfolio. So this is just a frequency distribution histogram. So over the 3 years, about 300 projects were approved and committed. And it just shows, the distribution of the climate share, the climate finance share of each of those projects. So each of the 3 columns represents the three years. So, we didn't expect a normal distribution, but we thought maybe it would be just a simple positively skewed. What we found was a U-shaped distribution, and I know there are other MDBs in the room. It would be interesting to see if you're finding a similar phenomena. And I just want to highlight the column on the group of columns on the right, and these are actually delivering. There are only 70 projects, but they're actually delivering 44% of our climate volume. So over this time period, ADB has been successful in developing projects and securing almost full climate finance for these projects. And it's increasing rapidly. So there's 2 questions here for evaluators. There's the accountability question. Are these our best projects? They're delivering most of the climate finance. Are they delivering the best results? That's one question. And the second question, maybe more relevant for this session, is the learning. If they're so important, what are we actually learning? Are they well designed? So that was one of the questions that we also had. So we dug a bit deeper into the results frameworks, bit like what Michelle was describing. So we over the 3 years, there were about, I think it was about 15 country partnership strategies approved. So we looked at those 15 country partnership strategies and their predecessors, so 30 country strategies altogether. And we looked at their strategic focus, the extent to which they had a climate pillar, and probably more importantly for this session, the extent to which climate indicators were represented in the results framework. So over the last sort of few years, most of our country strategies have a climate pillar. It's almost guaranteed. But more significantly, we doubled the share of climate indicators in our results frameworks to, I think it was about 28%. I don't have a chart for projects, but we also looked at the 300 projects in terms of their results frameworks. And it was positive for mitigation projects. From the last evaluation, I think it was about 30 or 40% had at least one indicator at the outcome level, whereas in this recent cohort of projects, it was up to about 80%. Not as good for adaptation. Only about 30% of adaptation projects had an indicator at the outcome level. A lot more on the output level, so that's kind of reflecting where a lot of ADB's projects in adaptation are climate proofing. So just some general comments on what we found in terms of learning and impact. One comment on the Paris alignment. Most of the MDBs have kind of committed to Paris alignment, and we've set up a system in ADB. And what we found was that even though obviously no investments were reported as not aligned, there was inconsistencies in disclosure and transparency and availability. But more importantly, no system to capture the lessons. We know from interviewing the staff involved that some project designs are being rejected, and designs are changing, but that sort of tacit knowledge is not being collected and fed back into the wider institution. Staffing and training was also an issue. Actually, over the period, we hired 80 new climate staff, but mostly for the sovereign. There was actually only 1 or 2 non-sovereign staff hired, so that's a bit of a gap. One thing I wanted to flag, and I'm kind of interested if this is something that affects other institutions, we put a huge amount of effort ex ante when we're designing our projects on climate. You know, we do Paris alignment assessments, we do climate risk vulnerability assessments, and we do the climate finance calculations, but they are never revisited again. You know, we look at the results framework, and as long as there are indicators in the results framework, that's what we track. But all this, and it's quite expensive, all these assessments, and there's a huge amount of knowledge there, and we would really we should be kind of capturing that knowledge, and even at the midterm, try to feed that back into new designs. But the reality is that if you look at our annual procurement performance report, you know, the average ADB project is somewhere between 6 to 7 years. It takes another year for them to produce a project completion report, and then the evaluators come in. So this learning loop has to be shortened. So just the key messages then. So definitely progress in ADB's climate action, and evaluability has improved in the results framework, so that's a positive. And letting targets are on track. But the evidence that has been generated from the ex-ante assessments it's not been fully exploited. And we need to capture that, we need to feed it back quicker, and we need to be able to demonstrate what climate outcomes these volumes of climate finance is delivering. And the learning loop must be shortened. And a shout out to GCF, they already have the independent midterm evaluations. I think they're the only institution that do that. And we're already starting to use them as a kind of an input for our evaluations. We can kind of get some early feedback on projects that we have that have co-financing with GCF. But I'll stop there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Garrett. It was really informative and good. And now I'm going to invite our last speaker. I think she needs a round of applause from all of us, being the last.
Afternoon, everyone. Well, thank you for being with us at the very last session of the day. So, okay, so this is the one. So marking the last presentation of the session today, I'd like to quickly share our findings and then assessment and then key takeaways from our recently conducted evaluation quality assessment. There we go. Okay, so I've been a bit lost to controlling the presentation. So this is just a quick snapshot of our pilot work, which was conducted early this year. That is designed pilot tested of the AE, our accredited entity RED evaluation report. So under our evaluation policy as well as our monitoring and accountability framework, or our accredited entity is supposed to submit their midterm and then final evaluation for all their funded activities. So this assessment was actually taken first to ensure AE RED evaluation, that how we implement our GCF evaluation policy, and then also this assessment to find out that how we can try to contribute to the enhance the quality as well as the credibility and consistency of the report. Just a brief coverage. So first, so we did conduct this assessment to make sure that how this covered the two pillars of our evaluation. First, evaluation standards, and second is evaluation criteria. So just in case we know there are various type of audiences with different backgrounds, so I'll just quickly pinpoint out what our evaluation standards and criteria is. So standards is more of our aspirational targets for the evaluation process from designing to report, and that it actually expands more beyond the evaluation conducting, but also cover planning and management and all other relevant activities. And then criteria is more of like a metrics and its coverage framework guiding the evaluation design, for example, like including the evaluation questions. I'll probably like show up more detailed information afterwards. So in development of the tools, we went through the brief desk review of our key documents, and then also benchmarked of the best practices of UN agencies, MDBs, and then other references, and then like build the scale and then get the scoring for like the weight for each component. And the tool what we developed actually also include qualitative feedback as well as quantitative ratings, referring GCF specific expectations and the UNEX standards as well. So it's mentioned that also this objective is to assess that how this align with the GCF evaluation standard and then how it covers the evaluation criteria. And then this piloting test is likely to summarized and then reported to the board and the secretariat with the SAYS objectives. Okay, so this assessment, as mentioned, it already mentioned that we are like a relatively young organization. So unlike evaluability studies, which were targeting FPs, we actually had two out of 222 evaluation reports. We just targeted the review completed, which is 60 of them. And then over there, we went through the purposive sampling of the 18 reports, including 14 interim and then 4 final, to make sure this evenly represent, like as far as we can, the various factors, including just this is the brief portfolio of the information of the midterm and then final evaluations we have assessed. And then, yes, So I will briefly share the findings from the pilot testing. So this is the overall ratings with the quality assessment tool template, which actually has 9 general sections. And then if you see over there, scaling from fair to exceptional, like the rubric metrics, and then about half of actually has shown just the fair level, which means there is a apparent room for improvement. And then, like it was not clearly mentioned there, but there's a highly rated section found that statements of background and then stating the evaluation findings were with the strong evidences. Meanwhile, there are still some omitted part, including the evaluation design and methodologies. And then more details can be shared for like our identified gaps, which I will mention later. And then also there is the kinds of limitation we have found for these piloting projects. As mentioned, that first that there is still like some room for the completeness of the report. So not only the evaluation report itself, I suppose we include other annexes or TORs, plans, and other supplement documents, which actually we were not able to fully assess on this pilot projecting. So if we like went through like see the exceptional or the very good this report with the high scoring on these ratings, actually primarily like conducted by UN agencies or like the MDBs, which already have a strong institutional capacities, as well as also maybe more friendly with the UNEX standards and all other like evaluation criteria which they was working for. And then in terms of alignment with our evaluation standards is that if you see like the more than half of those are either partially aligned or does not align with the evaluation standards. And then later I will like quickly share like the findings over there. So that's the standard average score, like the higher standards in accountability, credibility, rigor, cost effectiveness, but less like evidences or like the documentation found in ethics, competence, confidentiality. So back to what we have over there. Also, there's like a similar type of limits and then concerns. What we have is there is still we need a more accurate assessment, not only with the evaluation reports, but also there's like interviews or more documented Documentation, interviews, or other probably like a varied approaches might be needed for more accurate assessment. And also, one quick thing I'd like to note is this assessment is not conducted for compliance checking, but it's more of like a objective of like learning and then accountability aspects. Because for like one thing is that when they like says it's not aligned with GCF standards, does not mean that it does not meet what we have like stated as a checklist, because it doesn't necessarily indicate that it might be fulfilled, but it was just not clearly stated or documented. So that should be our consideration, that it doesn't align with like their performances or scorings. That's kinds of things I like to note before. And then also among those standards ratings, overall ratings, and I'll also briefly mention the criteria coverage at the later. So there has been some relationship found like that standards and criteria rating is strong among like the comparing the evaluation reports, but there is still probably like more assessment might be needed. How this correlation, like how like well it's correlated, like is it really correlated, like is there any causal effect? So that's kinds of like our still question mark remains in this piloting assessment. So this is standards, and then this is just a simple like the criteria reports that out of the 18 samples, if you see over there, the coverage-wise, this field of the criteria component, you see over there like a relevance, efficiency, and then sustainability-wise, it has a relatively high score. But if you see, and probably gender equity and then country ownership, if we are also concerned the partial coverages. But is over there, there is like EG's unexpected result, which actually was interestingly stated as the challenges in the evaluability study. And then innovativeness and replicability and then scalability are also kinds of like that its coverage is weak or like not mentioned or partially mentioned. Okay. So quick wrap up of the identified gaps among these our key findings and these pilot studies. As first is, it was mentioned in the overall EQA rating that there has been like missing of the clear methodology statement, and then including the detailed sampling as well as analysis process. And it could have been probably clearly mentioned, or like their evaluation planning as well as TOR is missing, probably caused those issues. And then the findings and then recommendation part, like probably like the level of analysis were like adequately mentioned, but still meanwhile there could be needed for a clear presentation of findings and then like clarification of the parties or stakeholders who might be responsible or what kinds of recommendation is needed. Yeah. And then lastly was the ethical consideration, which also was mentioned in the alignment with our evaluation standards, that there is in need of adequate explanation how ethical consideration were upheld, like for example, probably the inclusion of the code of conduct. And then probably I'd like to open this for like your consideration, like what area like we probably need to think of. So as mentioned, there's some clear limitation, including in this assessment is regarding the number of like limited reports available, and then like missing documents, and then some capacity gaps also like mentioned, and then how like clear documentation and its implementation, like alignment, those kinds of uncertainties still lays. So first, definitely, yes, we probably like need like in needs of the concise guidelines, how like where like the GCF expectation stands, and then like how the evaluation report should be developed like among AEs. And then providing targeted and tier support, definitely clearly just also mentioned that there's like huge capacity gap, like clear capacity gap was stated among probably like IAEs and then direct accredited entities or like regional bodies. So those further capacity building, it should be first like it mapped, and then we also should think of how we can like figuring out the tier support to figure like diagnosis, where their capacity stands right now, and then how it can be strengthened through the support of GCF. And then reviewing the evaluation resources. So we need to find out how the resources and timeframes allocated by AEs on evaluation, like how does it like commensurate with its size, the complexity, or probably the coverage of the project? Is it like relatively or like adequately assigned in terms of like a resource allocation? That also might be also good things to think of. And then like we probably like start initiating with this, probably take a look further through of the how it aligns with the GCF standards and then criteria to support like a further effective implementation. And then also think of the role of IEU, that how we can like take a separate review to better understand, and then like how the practices of our accredited entity to balance between our assessment criteria and all the standards what we have set. So that's what I have so far. And then, yeah, I look forward to our open discussion on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the presenters. Everyone, good job. We went through 4 rapid-fire presentations, and we are ready for a very short and sweet panel discussion because I promised the audience that I want to give them back some time for questions and answers. So, yeah, Garrett kindly told us that GCF IEU is a very young and dynamic independent evaluation office, and as you can see, we've been very busy. We not only do independent evaluations of the GCF's performance, but we are busy with evaluability studies. There have been 3 papers already, and the 4th one is coming. And then we also have global evidence reviews, and we just started also the evaluation quality assessment. So we've been quite busy. So now I want to turn to our panelists. So Andreas, you first spoke of the IEU's climate adaptation evidence review, right? And for those of you who attended one of the sessions yesterday about infrastructure, he said, quote unquote, don't be afraid of complexities, engage with complexities. So I want to ask you, we know that climate adaptation is very complex. So what kind of lessons did the evidence review, coupled with the IEU's evaluation of the GCF's adaptation portfolio, what did they provide that's useful for navigating these complexities and challenges with climate adaptation? Over to you.
You see, colleagues, this was not prepared. This was clearly, I'm getting a question right off the blue, right off the cuff. Colleagues, I think there's 2 things that I want to share maybe in this discussion of what has happened, perhaps also looking a little bit forward. One thing is we really tried to make sense of what can we bring sensibly to the board to discuss this massive area of climate change adaptation. And I think just looking at the portfolio and looking how well our partners are implementing the projects on the ground is insufficient to really instill a discussion, a proper discussion on what needs to happen at the GCF from a strategic perspective, from a portfolio perspective, but also from a project level perspective. And as you saw these presentations, I was repeatedly thinking, this is why we did this, this is why we did this, because there was really an unstoppable thirst for more information from the board, which I think is great. There's a great opportunity for an evaluation office to showcase how important evaluations can be. From a complexity perspective, we started to really think about how complex does a project really have to be. And we compared adaptation projects to mitigation projects. We tried to unpack what paradigm shift in these contexts means, what are drivers and attributors to transformational change, to paradigm shift. How can we make sense of this? How can we perhaps bring something that's meaningful to the discussion for future projects, but also to the discussion of what kind of portfolio do we want to see at the institutional level. And I think these discussions are a little bit outside of the normal work that an evaluation office would do. So we really very quickly gone into the space of strategy. in absence of a strategic or strategy department. Now there is a strategy department at the Secretariat, but there wasn't one until very recently. And another, that's the speech to that, to saying adaptation in an adaptation evaluation would have been insufficient to the discussion at the board. So that's why we needed to come with more, why we needed to bring more learning to the table. The second thought that I need to do is, most of these things that you see here have worked well in the past. I am doubting them repeatedly, and I also push my team to say, is this still in vogue? Is this still what we need in order to inform? So what I'm recognizing is that, at least from the GCF perspective, we have to reposition and reinvent ourselves every 5 years. At least with every new executive director, we have to change. And we have to see what is it that we need to speak about, what is it that we can bring to the table to stay relevant. There are things that stay as such, to not say ADB is is old and dusty, but a little bit more the ADB model. Certain things need to be there, but then we're starting to rethink what else do we need to bring to the table. So for instance, for evidence reviews and evidence gap maps, I think they were great in the beginning, they're not great anymore. So I'm thinking we need to go beyond that and bring a little bit more questions about rigor and what is really impact in the areas and what is really working and not working. So that's what we're trying to do at the moment. I'm sorry, this was really not prepared, but I hope that makes sense.
Thank you very much. I really like that you continue to question whether these tools are still relevant. Rigorous. My mic is not working. But anyway, so thank you for that. And I'm going to turn to Michelle. So the evaluability study series that the IEU has, we've talked about some of the small wins that the office had, informing the board and the GCF Secretariat. Yeah?
Let's read this one.
Okay. All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So, from the 3 studies, and especially the most recent one, the third one, so what are the fundamental gaps and issues with the GCF funding proposals and their evaluability? And please be brief in your intervention.
Hello. In terms of the gap, as I summarized in the end, so it's basically, there are mainly 2 gaps that remain. Reporting of the unintended consequence, there are more works to be done, and also really looking at the causal impact, if we can credibly trust the impact that is being mentioned. But I also want to mention that this evaluability study, it sets the bar very high, so it's ambitious work. So it goes beyond what's required within the results management framework. So we don't just look into if there's a theory of change, a log frame. We really try to understand if the theory of change is robust, if we can attribute the impact to the project. So by having a low score, by seeing that there's a gap, it doesn't mean that it's a failure. But we try to continuously improve through this evaluability work.
Thank you. Now I'm turning to Garrett. I really like the point that you made about how we are not really revisiting the ex ante work, the vulnerability assessment and all that. So what are the main barriers, do you think, to integrating these assessments into the project evaluation cycle? Do you have any thoughts and maybe a good way forward as well?
Is this working?
Yeah.
Great. Great. Thank you, Yonji. I'm trying to think how I can weave in Andreas's comment about old and dusty into my response.
Sorry.
I think I can link it to the guidelines, and I think our guidelines are a little bit old, but we are actually working to update them. And I think it's important we mention the guidelines because, or like the evaluation guidelines, because the easy answer is to say it's a self-evaluation problem. We just take whatever they give us, whatever the project completion report says is what we evaluate, but I don't think that's fair. I think, we need to get the different parts of the institution together, the sort of strategy and policy department, ourselves, the operations departments, our implementation, procurement departments, to see how we need to update and improve our evaluability in our work. So yeah, I think it's a two-way street, and I think probably I would also add we need to go out to our developing member countries and get their view. How useful are these assessments? You know, is it just a compliance exercise that where you have some climate finance, the project teams are required to prepare these, or do they genuinely work with the governments to tweak designs that are going to work and improve climate outcomes? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I like the fact that ADB has country partnership strategies, so that's developed for each country that you serve, and I don't think GCF has that, although we now set up regional desks and they are more tailored to the needs of these world regions. Okay, thank you for that. Now turning to Buyang. So yes, you delivered some key findings from the recent evaluation quality assessment, looking at 18 midterm evaluation reports and some final evaluation reports. Could you give an example of maybe a good or excellent midterm evaluation that you considered? You don't need to give details, but what are some of the characteristics of that project and the evaluation report?
Okay, is it working? Okay, good. Well, yeah, I mean, definitely, as mentioned in the presentation, there was like apparent gap between like what it was good, like exceptional report, like marking almost like 90+% of the ratings, while still some of those still stays about like 60-70%. And then, I mean, definitely, it's also up to how they to comprehend like those like standards and then criteria what we have stated, and also like how the kinds of terms of familiarity or like the level of understanding definitely influence or like how they try to produce like the report itself. I mean, I'm not really going to mention like which institutions or which entities like had like good or not, but there's definitely like a specific characteristics. I should mention definitely the TOR. Like, do they have like the clear TOR as an annex? That actually has been definitely good for us to understand which criteria has been like well reflected and then like well considered. So probably we can like for further steps with this pilot testing, we definitely should think of how we can expand our coverages or like probably approaches for more assessment or to like benchmarking for those good studies.
Okay, so that was a quick kind of first round of panel discussion, but I want to see if we have any questions or comments from the audience already. Oh, several. Okay. I do think you need to use a standing mic, so please, yes, you first, and I'm going to go in the order from the top.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Megan Kennedy-Schwan, and I'm from the OECD. I wanted to ask Buyang about your quality assessment, and if you had done any looking at the use of the evaluation reports or their perceived usefulness from the intended target audience, because what we've seen in some other quality reviews was that even though evaluations were rated as being poor quality, they were rated very highly in terms of use, which is an interesting / maybe scary conclusion to find. So I was just curious if you had any perception or had heard anything in your discussions with program officers. And then the other question I wanted to ask, which I guess is for Garrett and Andreas mainly, but when you said you have like 100% alignment with the Paris Agreement, doesn't that seem a little bit odd? I mean, is that because we have a bar that's far too low? It kind of reminds me of like the relevance criterion for climate adaptation. You very rarely see anything that's not kind of rated as relevant. So is there anything that we could do to try to raise the bar in terms of ambition, given the trajectory that we're like way off track in terms of actually achieving the Paris Agreement? So how can we keep rating ourselves as doing well on alignment? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, Yash,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Niazi, AG from Maldives. Thank you for the presentations. I just wanted to emphasize that from the Supreme Audit Institution's perspective, we have a working group on environmental audit, and we have developed a climate scale, a toolkit which uses to assess the environment risks of national governments. It looks at the perspectives from the governance, public policy, and climate financing. We'll be presenting our findings at the COP. About 80 countries would be finding, research is being incorporated into that. So, and in terms of data, of course, the initial findings is also coming in for, especially for the small island developing states. But we have to pause and think what it means. Especially as evaluators, I have a few suggestions. One thing is in your evaluation, I believe we need to look at the time it takes from the actual initiation to actual financing. And secondly, what does it mean? What are the costs involved for, and what are the damages that had actually been done? Because for climate change, it waits for no one, and the damage is already done. So, for example, like for land erosion, within 10 years, the damage is already done. So, because of the quality of data, probably the development partners takes time to actually approve the project. So, I think as evaluators, we need to look at that perspective. And thirdly, I would like to think about what could be done to reverse this cycle. So it all goes back to the data. Of course, national government has a responsibility to improve the data, but as development partners, what could be done with regard to quality data, especially when SIDS, which doesn't have the level of capacity and which haven't maintained the data over a long time, is unable to or facing challenges to present these data as per the development partners, formats. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Shall we take one more question? So maybe from this side, do you mind? Okay.
Thanks for panelists from GCF and ADB for the informative presentations. My name is Hao Qing. I'm from Harbin Institute of Technology in China. It's really good to see the high-level literature review for those studies related to climate risk or things like that. I just saw one thing it was very sad to see is the predictive or simulation-based studies are excluded from the review because we have done lots of those type of studies. So I want to promote it a little bit because those studies, although it's predict the future with uncertainty, but we have strict calibration to the historical observations, and so that the mechanism of those studies are already approved, then it's applied to future conditions, things like that. So hopefully it's going to be integrated in for the next round of evaluation. And my actual question is that I saw the evaluation is at the high level for project portfolios. I just wonder for the local-based and the project-based level, you require lots of localized knowledge, local data, or those global causal links or those rules. And now, whether there's it's necessary to adapt those to localized level, whether your evaluation gonna be project-based or place-based to have more detailed information, detailed data, or more granularity. That's my question. Thanks.
All right, I promise we will get through all the questions. So please let us respond to the first round of questions. So I'm really glad that the questions are already addressing the theme for this year's Asian Evaluation Week, which is navigating crises and building on successes. So thank you for these excellent questions. So maybe the first question to Buyong about the EQA, the intended audience, what happens if the quality of evaluation is low, but then the use of that evaluation is high? That's a really interesting scenario. So maybe you can answer that first.
Yes, so like, yes, as you mentioned, there's always the possibility that fully, I mean, I would not say it's like fully, because I would like say like maybe probably not all the good performances doesn't really like comes into a great evaluation. There's always, you know, for us, the room for interpretation, and then how it comes out, and then also like how it is comprehended and digested by the targeted audiences. So actually, I mean, that's pretty much connected with our kinds of main objectives, like to find out like how like bring out the accountability, like how credible this is. And then, yes, as mentioned, there has been some weak section with the evidences or like even in like performances in this assessment. And then that's actually where also we pointed out how they can deliver the message, especially like for clarity or like completeness or the conciseness, those kinds of things. So that's also like one of the reasons why we pointed out even in the very early stages, before not many of our projects are in mature stages right now, because I mean, as you mentioned, now like it's time for all those interim evaluations are just coming out, and that is kind of like the snapshot of how it is like delivered, and then this probably might be considered as like their outcome, and then how it is considered. So that was like, I mean, for us, like that's our like a main objective to point out. And then like, as you mentioned, definitely in terms of those like the gaps with their performances and then how it is presented, like probably need to just keep reinforcing with our stakeholders or like the entities in delivery.
Thank you. Garrett, the 100% alignment with Paris Agreement, is the bar too low?
Yes, it is now.
It's working now. Okay, great. Great question, Regan. I think, I mean, the way that commitment was framed for most of the MDBs was kind of an all or nothing. So the objective was that we would be 100% Paris aligned by a certain date for sovereign or non-sovereign operations. So, which is unfortunate in a way, in that, you know, the institutions are not really required to unpack what happened below that threshold, you know, and anecdotally, when we interview the project officers and sort of the climate team, you know, we know that there was lots of dialogue where designs were rejected and changes were made, but you know, our message in the report was that was kind of a lost opportunity. You know, we're not really sort of learning from those design changes, documenting them, and improving the sort of the institution's knowledge on that. So great question, but that's probably the best response I can give. Maybe Andreas has more to say.
You want me to speak briefly? Okay. Colleagues, Megan, what tricky questions you are asking? So for the use of evaluations, very clearly, yes, it's in the standards. So standard 7 talks about learning, standard 3 about utility and value add, standard 15 about beneficients. All of them have shortcomings. So learning is probably the best one that we try to use for that. Value add and utility is usually at institutional level. So it's not talking about the use in the field. So that's a shortcoming there. And standard 15, beneficients, is talking more about respect and how respectful we have been working with the beneficiaries in the country in terms of the evaluation and the work there. So it's, I would say, the combination of all three perhaps, but it's definitely a shortcoming. Use of evaluation, great question. 100% alignment on Paris Agreement. It makes me chuckle every time I think about it. The fund has absolutely overhauled, after the first evaluation that we've done on the results management framework, has absolutely overhauled its approach to results management, they call it, not measurement, management. And there they really said we want to think about the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, and they have to be integrated into the approach of management of results. A lot. But at the end of the day, again, that's a leap of faith, right? That we're going from what is the project bringing in its project context to what is the institution learning from this, and what does that mean to the Paris Agreement? So my best guess is it's almost always not linked. Unfortunately, just because the information is probably not wide enough, not deep enough, not comprehensive enough to say anything about this. And it bears the question, one question that we have, I think others, NDBs are far better on this. The GCF is a bit challenged by this question of portfolio approach. So I don't think we have a strong foot, when we're putting a strong foot forward for a portfolio approach. And therefore, there's very little to then say and aggregate at that level to bring that to the Paris Agreement. I hope that helps, yeah.
Okay, Andreas, really quickly, can you react to the suggestions about, the quality of data and the
yes.
Maldives, and also the inclusion of localized knowledge in our evidence reviews? Really quickly, please.
Okay. Sorry, I said Mauritius. It's Maldives, of course. Sorry for that. I really enjoy this, that you come in very strongly from the audit perspective, very strongly from the country perspective. I truly believe we're not doing enough to understand context. And the data requirements shock me every time I think about it. I understand that our people in the GCF that think about results and monitoring and all these sorts of things, they're very, very much in favor of this. I'm starting to ask, is it really necessary to ask so many questions about data? Do we need on an annual basis all these sorts of indicators answered or not? My hunch would be it's far better to talk about qualitative information and have a midterm, and I really truly believe in a midterm, the midterm to be the first check-in to say, are we reaching anywhere close to what we said we wanted to do? And then the final evaluation again come at the end of the project and say, have we done what we wanted to do in terms of impacts? And for that, data is relevant. But you're absolutely right. Otherwise, I'm a little bit concerned with the approach that we're driving on data needs. So I'm fully with you. I'm thinking about timing that you said, the damage is already done. I think this is perfect because I think the loss and damage fund should be in here in this conversation in the evaluation office. There's no evaluation office for the loss and damage fund, by the way. But those guys that think about that should look at that as well.
All right, thank you for your patience. So all those colleagues who raised your hand, please, let's go through all the questions, but please be brief with your questions so that we have time to answer them. Okay, thank you.
I'll be really brief. This is, you can hear me. This is for my good friend Garrett from IED. You've said you need to shorten the climate learning loop, if I'm not mistaken. First of all, what is the learning loop, the way you defined it? And secondly, just like you can't hurry love, maybe you shouldn't be hurrying the learning loop. There's a lesson there.
Thanks, Gambir. I guess, we're traditionally we're known as an infrastructure bank, and we often do, multiple projects, phase 1, phase 2, and sometimes that learning loop is natural. The same project teams are working in the same country, in the same sector, and they can adapt and learn, and that tacit knowledge actually stays within the team quite quickly. But what the weakness we see is that from the climate perspective, it needs to be a bit more formalized. A bit more support is needed to sort of capture those climate dimensions that are not routine for many of the project officers. And often we see quite junior members of the team are being tasked with some of these assessments. So it's not really given the priority that it probably should have. And they're expensive. So it's really, we're not really maximizing our cost effectiveness in some of these ex-ante approaches. So the formal learning loop is just too long, where, as I said, we wait for 7 years, a year for the completion report, and then a year for us. So it's looking for ways to incorporate those lessons earlier on for the next phase of our interventions.
Thank you. Yes, the gentleman here. We'll collect a few more questions.
Thank you. My question is also for Garrett. Sorry.
I'll leave the mic on.
It's a bit of an academic question since I'm coming from an academic community. This climate action evaluations or climate adaptation evaluations are complex and unique, as you mentioned. From the concept of Paris Agreement or the concept relevant to UNFCCC, when you go for evaluations, the evidences that you find are mostly empirical, having a geographical bias on the timeline, or having a thematic bias. And then when you come to the evaluations, these evaluations are mostly prediction-based. So how do you adjust your evaluation approaches to fit into these basic changes that you see in the approach? Thank you.
Just very briefly, there's an IEG evaluator, and I'm really sorry I can't remember his name, but he did a lot of the climate evaluations in the 2010, 2011, 2012. It was under Vinod Thomas. And I was at one of his presentations a few years ago, and he made this point that for adaptate, I think someone gave the name there. So yes, exactly, Ken Chomitz. Thanks for that. He made a really interesting point. He said, from the adaptation point of view, will we actually ever get to ex post? And it's kind of related to, it's a slightly depressing comments in a way, but I think the point is we need to be more adaptive and I think that is the same for evaluators. And one thing we've tried in some of our work is to use sort of non-traditional methods to capture evidence. So using, in the case of, say, flood risk management, using remote sensing or radar to look at the impact the resilience measures had on infrastructure. So I think we have to think of those kind of alternative evidences to support our work.
Okay, and then, do you mind if I go here first? Okay, here we go.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Justin Donia Chen, and this city, Xi'an, is my hometown, so I wear traditional clothes yesterday. So if you need any help for local things, I'm willing to help. And yes, I'm also the UNESCO Youth Ambassador for COP29 and World Economic Forum Davos New Champion Delegate and member of EVA Youth China. So recently we have a cooperation with UNICEF and Tsinghua University in China. So my question is, maybe speak for all the youth or evaluation young specialists that given that young generation will be the generation living in the climate change problem area in the future for human society, while youth lead organizations are often excluded from climate fund allocation process. Could you give us some suggestions about youth as individual or as an organization, how to have some more participants in climate finance governance or collaboration with financial intermediaries? Thanks.
Thank you. Can we go to the next? Yeah, please go ahead.
Mitch Ragusin, ADB. Question for Andreas. Really appreciated the evidence gaps. As I was looking up there, I didn't see some sectors that I thought would be up there, and maybe it's because they're self-evidently contributing, but yeah, energy, circular economy, urban, just wondering if it's non-exhaustive on purpose or if you have that, and whether or not you're actually creating an evidence portal that would be externally accessible, because that's something we're keen to access and also replicate. And then a question for Michelle. The evaluability criteria, is there any consideration to use that as a formal ex ante impact assessment tool to make some kind of approval or decision. And like Garrett, I'd be really keen to see how ADB fares, but to that point, do you plan on having any feedback loop to your accredited partners institutions on the way they've performed in that? I'd certainly also be interested in that. Thank you.
Let's get the last question. Yeah, please be brief. Yeah.
So thank you for your perfect discussions and presentations. And I'm so happy to see that GCF has a wonderful gender equality on the representatives. And yes, so my question is, do you have any views or lens on the gender responsive evaluation works? What do you find? And what do you find the gaps must be closed? And because climate crisis do more harms to vulnerable groups, especially women, children, and also the indigenous groups. So I want to ask, what does your department found? And thank you.
Okay, I'm going to group some questions. So, Andreas, can you take the evidence gaps? Also, can you say something briefly about the matter of youth and innovation? I'm really glad that you stayed in this session, not the other session, because they discussed youth participation. But as the head of the IEU, I think you should say something first. Okay, on those 2 points.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. Sorry, bear with me a little bit. I'm trying to conduct myself. So here, on the evidence gap maps, great question. It purposefully was cut to what we think in the GCF is the approach for climate change adaptation. So we did not look into energy, although energy access is clearly also an adaptive process. But from the perspective of the GCF, energy is mostly a mitigation area. So we have that in a different kind of evidence gap map. In terms of publications, we usually team up with international organizations that allow us to publicize this. They're all publicly available already. Most of them were in the past with FreeIE. I can't speak to the most recent one because honestly, we're just reviewing the last final one. But we're doing them for the greater good. So it's a public good. You're absolutely invited to look at them. I'll take the evaluability study just right away. So we move on. From the evaluability study perspective, we initiated this because the board asked us to do it in order for them to get a handle on what the evaluability looks like from the project documentation perspective, without knowing what the impacts are on the ground. Certainly an interesting idea. I will take this back. If there could be an ex ante tool, that's interesting. And feedback loops to the AEs is something that we're planning for the next round. So we want to have that as an iterative process. But in essence, the study was done to really push a little bit at the board front to say you need to let these people that talk about impact come in as early as possible into the conversation about project development and project review and appraisal. Youth and gender. We're just conducting a gender evaluation right now. I know Buyong is part of that team, but I caution her not to speak right now because these are not verified results. But what we're finding is we look at the continuum and the spectrum of gender considerations. So we look at gender sensitivity, gender responsiveness, and gender transformation to really look at transformative outcomes in the GCF. At the moment, we find that we're quite good in the earlier parts. We're a little less good when it comes to gender outcomes. That's something where the fund could learn, but we're looking into this a little bit deeper. So we have no results as of now, but it is a consideration for in half a year I will be able to speak about it. But it's definitely a consideration because the fund says it's gender sensitive throughout. So we're looking at this from the portfolio perspective. And youth evaluators. Listen, I recognize that youth is not always being considered, both for evaluation but also for projects. I recognize that the GCF could do a lot more there. What the GCF is trying to do with its readiness and country ownership is really to enhance the approach in which we bring projects. So we want to see projects being done and agreed to by what we call a country-owned process, and that should involve youth as well. But youth groups have been systematically been excluded in most of these processes. Some countries have learnings there where they included them, others not so much. So great question. For the evaluation, the same thing. We're starting on adaptive evaluations as well, where we can involve young evaluators as well around the globe to work with us on some of these evaluations. It's early days because it's very complex. So we're shying away to say full frontal, we do this everywhere, but we wanting to learn in that front as well from other colleagues at UNEG as well, because there are such processes of adaptive evaluations. Just to the colleague from China, from the institute there, on the climate risk and the portfolio to local based work, you're absolutely right. I think as evaluators we're failing at the moment to speak to this local context and the question of what can be done there. That's an omission we hope to close. We can't do everything, but we hope to consider this in the future, as well as the forecast studies that you mentioned. With AI and forecast measures, a lot of things have changed, right? So we're also trying to see what are the new products that could be coming from an independent evaluation unit to inform decision making. Yeah, that's done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Garrett, there was a very specific question
for you.
Yeah, for you, right? The lessons
Hang on.
for accredited entities and, right? Yeah, the question from the gentleman.
Oh, sorry.
You missed it? No, did you note the question?
No. All right. I don't have it. Colleagues, maybe we'll do that afterwards. Are we running out of time or is there time?
Yeah, I think the other session
running out.
closed. I just wanted to address all the questions, so thank you for your patience. Do talk to us, especially on gender responsiveness. We have lessons available from the impact evaluations that we conducted, and Michelle Dong right here is the right person you should ask those questions to. So thank you again. You've been a great audience yourself, so you should all get an evaluation brief from the GCF IEU as a prize on your way out. Also, don't forget to take the feedback survey for our Asian Evaluation Week Secretariat colleagues for their learning as well. Thank you, and I invite you also to our GCF-GEF joint session on Thursday, 9 a.m. It's about environmental evaluation for inclusive and resilient growth. So find us there. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you. Okay. Unfortunately,